Hi everybody, thank you for joining in. Today we have a vintage skin diver or a dive style watch. It's got an inexpensive little pen lever movement, very similar to those found in those vintage Timexes. Let's get his hands rotated so we can pop those off. Look at these hands and the dials stored away. Yeah, so these movements in these things are, they lack the jewels on the pallet fork. The pallet fork strikes the escape wheel, which is what causes which releases the energy for the watch to tick. And on one hand, it's impressive that these can run at all, but I do find that these pen lever movements tend to be hit or miss as to how reliable I've been able to get them to be. But we'll take a stab at this one. I'm going to go ahead and start with the calendar mechanism. Get our little date wheel. This little finger. Just kind of note that spring. And our arrow wheel. And we'll flip this back over to the, oh, something fell out. That is the winding pinion. It mates up with the sliding pinion on the stem. We'll tighten this down and power this down. There was not a lot of power in there, which is not necessarily a bad sign. It means that it is able to at least run down. Here on the balance, you can see the 1 jewel in this movement. Swiss made 1 jewel. That's what the majority of these type movements are. And this is an EB8810. There's also a very similar EB8800. And there are no date versions and also 2-hand versions that doesn't have the seconds hand. Now we'll get to our pallet fork. And on this pallet fork, you'll see the pins it has instead of the jewels. The barrel is held down in a very industrial sort of design method here, very inexpensively done with this strap, very much like a battery strap. We'll make the screwdriver sing to get this ratchet wheel off. The barrel also has a very unusual arbor kind of setup. See that a little later. Nothing to see here. Get this screw for the click. It's a little spring under here. It's on the other side of this plate here. Need to remember and not lose it. Just checking to make sure there's nothing unusual there. And now we can get our wheels, just kind of inspecting things as I'm pulling them off. Grab a sliding pinion since it's looking right at me. You can see in that little oval well there as a spring. I'm going to use some Rodico here and pry this out with my tweezers. Back to the dial side. Take this little cover plate off, which also is a spring. Oh, that was clumsy. You really shouldn't leave screws in place when you have multiple screws like this. The best practice is to one screw at a time. That helps you prevent losing screws. Don't ask me how I know this. Come on, minute wheel. Instead of setting the lever screw, we had this pin. I'm just pushing it through. Here's our yoke, which is a built-in yoke spring. We'll get this stuff in the cleaner. I've seen a lot worse, but I'm hoping there's some grime in there because it's certainly not been running well. And here's our main spring. It doesn't look too badly. We'll work this thing back in here. You'll see that there's no barrel arbor. At least it is kind of this weird built-in design. So it's got this Swiss-made stamping on the movement, but you can look at the components. Clearly, this was made very economically. You know, the strap that holds down the barrel arbor design, you know, the pen lever escapement. It certainly wasn't built with the highest quality in mind. Now that said, I would much rather have this over the vintage Timex movement, that all metal construction. And I'm not hating on Timex. I'm just saying I wish that they had gone with something more like this that's a little more serviceable. There's another movement maker that you might have heard of, Ronda. They still make a lot of quartz movements today, found in a lot of watches, a lot of Swiss watches. They made a lot of these wind-jeweled movements as well, very similar to this with the pen lever escapement. And the Ronda movements, in some ways, well, some of the components were of a higher quality, but I've actually seen where most of those where maybe the weak point was the escape wheel pivots. Get our click spring back in here, holding it down with this little silicone rod that I use for polishing. Gonna be really sure that that's in there. I don't want that thing pinging off. And you can see the little finger there that works with the click. All right, let's see how we do lining up these pivots in this plate, or bridge, I should say. Looks like it's so close. Have to hold this tight enough and loose enough, yet nudge these wheels around so that they find the pivots. Man, oh, ha ha ha. And let's not forget our click. Make sure it's on the right side of that spring. Obviously, want it interacting with our ratchet wheel. I guess technically this is our barrel bridge. Oil time. Get our ratchet wheel in. You know, I don't think I mentioned it when we took it off, but remember the screw is reverse threaded. Pretty good. It's a pretty intricate fidget spinner. Now we're we'll get our pallet fork in here. Our stoneless pallet fork. Try and get this cock over the pivot. It's really easy to damage pallet fork pivot. That's pretty loose, so I think we're good. Put some wind in here. See how freely this goes. So we're in good shape. Put some grease on our winding pinion and get our sort of preset our sliding pinion. So sometimes it's a little easier to drop in place when they're together like that. And lube up our stem. I mentioned earlier my success rate on these are kind of hit or miss. You know, they're not hard to work on. Get our yoke set in here. I just suspect the biggest problem is probably in the escapement between those pins on the fork and the edges of the escape wheel. We'll just get our setting lever back in place. A little lube for our minute wheel. A little lubrication for our hour wheel. And go ahead and get this pivots while we're at it. So this doesn't have a typical cannon pinion. We're not ready to put the date wheel on yet. No, I do eventually realize this, and we'll put this off to the side here. And we'll put this little cover that has the spring for the setting lever. Probably the next biggest problem I've seen in these movements that I've come across are really badly damaged hairsprings. I doubt that's the manufacturer's fault. It's probably hacks like me getting in here. You got to learn somehow though, folks. Don't let mistakes or the possibility of mistakes stop you from doing this. You're going to make mistakes, but at least I know I'm going to make mistakes because you guys point them out in the comments. Some of you guys are pretty nice about it. Some of you guys are not so nice about it. That's fine. I appreciate it either way. Speaking of procedure, this is not the right way to do this. But I noticed the setting for that pivot on the other side didn't look quite right. So I felt like this was the better method for me to kind of put that drop of oil and let the balance wheel pivot spread the oil as I put it in. Now, unfortunately, I think I inadvertently deleted the footage of me doing the easy part for the balance, taking the one jewel out. But it's pretty standard. It's that 3-pronged jewel setting that you rotate. It came out pretty easily with some Rodico. You know, I switched it around some alcohol, buffed it up, drop of oil, and getting the spring back in. I actually used a little piece of pegwood that I filed down to the shape of the shock setting so that I can rotate that spring back in pretty easily. That didn't sound good. Check to make sure the date corrector, there we go, is engaging. Now we get our little finger in place for the date wheel. Come on, Flipper. I guess I've been kind of going through a phase where I've kind of become enamored with these vintage skin diver style watches. There's so many brands that were pumping these things out. Some of them look exactly the same. A few have you know, some maybe like different markers. They may have like crosshairs, maybe variations on the numerals, but you kind of just get the feel that maybe they were all being made on the same street or something. And most of them are these 1 joule movements. There are a few that have 17 joule movements. You know, and some of those use the Swiss lever, you know, the pallet fork with the stones that, at least in my view, run a little nicer than the pin lever escapements. My chair's so creaky. Okay, don't look too closely because I haven't washed this case yet, but I'm so excited. I just want to see how it runs on the wrist. I find that a lot of times these watches will run fine on the bench or the table, as I have. And once you get them on the wrist, though, gravity just does its thing and they just don't, you know, sometimes they'll just come to a stop. I'm going to change the strap too. This one's fine, but you can let me know which one you prefer. So just remember, this has the water resistance of tissue paper. I tried a few different straps and I settled on this reddish brown leather strap. I really even like that worn patina edge of the bezel there on the left between the 40 and the 50 marker. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for joining in, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, take care.